I brought my son to the hospital for his next round of chemo when the doctor stopped us and said, "Your child never had cancer." I glanced over at my son, who was clearly weak, bald, and thin after months of treatment, and told the new oncologist he had to be wrong. He turned his computer screen toward me. No tumors, no cancer cells, nothing. Not in today's SCNs or any previous test from the last 6 months. I felt the floor drop out from under me. That's impossible. And look at him, and he's dying. The doctor frowned at the files. Your original doctor is on leave and these records are incomplete, but there's never been a single cancer marker. What medications is he taking? My son spoke up in his small voice. Just vitamins. The doctor shook his head. Vitamins wouldn't cause this. Bring me everything he consumes. Food, drinks, supplements, everything. I'm running extensive toxicology panels. He scribbled his number on a piece of paper. Call me the second anything seems off. I left the hospital shaking as I looked at my little boy. If he doesn't have cancer, why was my son dying? I tore apart our medicine cabinet that night and brought everything to the doctor in 2 grocery bags. The test revealed nothing unusual in the bottles themselves, but my son's blood work was showing mysterious toxin levels that shouldn't be there. So I started bringing in samples of meals we had at home. I was desperate. While waiting for more test results, I found myself scrolling through my husband's social media page where he posted heartfelt videos of my son's journey to recovery. I was always thankful for the support he gave, especially the fundraising page that helped us a lot over the months. I continued scrolling through the comments, hoping the support would help keep my mind off of things when I noticed something strange. One person, a woman named Bryn, kept commenting on every single post with the same horrible messages. Don't donate. This is a scam. Don't trust him. And I thought, what kind of twisted person would do this on a cancer fundraising page? In my anger, I clicked on the profile. I sent her a message asking, "Lady, what's the big deal? Why are you leaving comments like this on my husband and child's page?" She responded almost instantly. "Your husband? Meet me tomorrow at the McDonald's with the playground. Don't let him know." I went to the fast food restaurant alone and found Bryn in the corner, staring out the window with hollow eyes. "Your son doesn't have cancer, does he?" she asked before I could even sit down in front of her. "How did you know?" "Because my Nora never had it either." Then she pulled out her phone and showed me a picture of her daughter, and my husband all smiling at the hospital. After Nora died, I couldn't function. I was destroyed, but something kept bothering me about how fast everything happened at the end. So I paid for a private toxicology screening on some of her belongings. I'd kept hair from her brush, baby teeth she'd lost during treatment. Her hands were shaking. She was poisoned, and I found out too late. Before I could ask more questions, my phone rang. It was the doctor. I played the call on speaker. "Hello?" The toxicology results came back. "Your son has methotrexate and arsenic in his system. He's being systematically poisoned. We've cross-referenced it with everything you gave us, and we found traces in the cereal. Ma'am, please bring your son back to the hospital as soon as possible for treatment." Bryn slammed her fist on the table when he hung up. I knew it. I've been trying to warn people, but everyone thinks I'm just a grieving mother who's lost her mind. She began tearing up. "He's a nurse. Worked in pediatric oncology for 5 years before you met. He knew exactly what doses would cause the cancer symptoms." She leaned forward. "You need to catch him in the act. Set up cameras, document everything, get a video of him doing it. Without proof, he'll get away with it again, just like he did with Nora." I rushed home and set up a hidden camera in the kitchen that streamed to my phone. The next morning, I pretended to leave for work, but parked down the street instead. I watched the feed as my husband poured cereal into my son's favorite bowl, then reached into the back of the cabinet and pulled out a prescription bottle hidden in a pack of sugar. He opened it carefully and crushed 2 white pills with a spoon before sprinkling it over the cereal and mixing it in with milk. "Breakfast is ready, buddy," he called out in his sing-song voice. I ran back to the house and burst through the door just as my son was lifting the first spoonful to his mouth. I knocked the bowl from his hands and it shattered on the floor. My husband stared at me and I watched him realize I knew. That's when the kitchen door slammed open. Bryn stood there pointing a gun at my husband. "Hello, Curtis," Bryn said. His eyes widened. "Bryn, how did you find me? I've been waiting so long for this." I stepped forward. "Bryn, we have the video now. Let the police handle this." She shook her head. "They didn't believe me when Nora died. They won't believe you either. He's too smart." My husband pulled my son in front of him. "You won't shoot me in front of a child. Watch me," Bryn said, and took the safety off the gun. I threw myself at Bryn from the side just as her fingers started squeezing the trigger. The gun went off with a crack that made my ears ring, and I felt the heat of it pass near my head. Curtis screamed and yanked my son behind the kitchen island while Bryn and I hit the floor hard. We rolled across the broken cereal bowl, and I grabbed her wrist, trying to force the gun away from everyone. She was stronger than she looked, and we both grunted as we struggled, knocking over a chair that crashed against the counter. My son was crying so hard behind the island that I could hear him gasping for breath between sobs. I managed to pin Bryn's gun hand against the floor, but she used her other arm to shove at my face. The gun was still in her grip, and I knew if she got it pointed at anyone again, someone would die. I yelled at my son to run to the neighbor's house right now, my voice coming out harsh and desperate. He peeked around the edge of the island, his face wet with tears and his whole body shaking. For one awful second, he just stared at me and Bryn wrestling on the floor, and I thought he was too scared to move. Then he bolted for the back door, his small feet slapping against the tile. I heard the door bang open and his sneakers pounding across the wooden deck and then the grass. Bryn tried to twist under me to look where he went, and I used that moment to slam her hand against the the floor again. The gun skittered away toward the refrigerator, and we both lunged for it at the same time. That's when I heard the sirens, faint at first, but getting louder fast. That rising and falling wail that meant police were coming. Bryn heard them too, and her eyes went wide. I realized my phone must still be in my pocket from when I called 911 earlier, and it had stayed connected this whole time. They heard everything. The gun going off, the screaming, all of it. Bryn stopped fighting and just lay there breathing hard, staring at the ceiling where the bullet had punched a hole through the drywall. I scrambled away from her and grabbed the gun off the floor, holding it carefully by the grip, even though my hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep my fingers steady. Curtis was still behind the island, and I could hear him crying too, making these high-pitched sounds like an animal caught in a trap. The sirens got so loud they had to be right outside, and then they cut off suddenly. Car doors slammed, and I heard boots running up the front walkway. The front door exploded inward, and police officers flooded into the house with their guns drawn, yelling commands so fast I couldn't process them all. I dropped Bryn's gun immediately and put my hands up, shouting that I lived here and the gun wasn't mine. Bryn already had her hands in the air, and she wasn't moving at all, just kneeling on the floor with her head down. The officers kept yelling at both of us to get on the ground, and I did, pressing my face against the cold tile that still had milk and cereal stuck to it. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out, and I kept trying to tell them about my son, that he ran next door, that someone needed to check on him. An officer grabbed my arms and pulled them behind my back, but he was gentler than I expected. He helped me up to my knees while two other officers moved in on Bryn with handcuffs. Another officer circled around the kitchen island toward Curtis, his gun still pointed at him. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, even with the officer holding my arm. I kept asking if someone checked on my son next door, saying it over and over because I couldn't think about anything else. The officer holding me said something into his radio and then told me my son was okay. A female officer came through the back door a minute later and confirmed that my son was safe with the neighbor, and a paramedic was checking him over right now. I felt my knees go weak with relief, and the officer had to hold me up. Curtis was handcuffed now, and he was crying and talking fast, saying this was all a big misunderstanding. He kept saying Bryn was crazy and broke into our house, that he didn't do anything wrong. His voice had that same sweet tone he used when talking to our son, and it made me feel sick. The officers weren't listening to his explanations, and they moved him toward the front door, still talking. More police kept arriving, and the house filled with people in uniforms, some taking pictures of the bullet hole in the ceiling and the broken bowl on the floor. Within 15 minutes, a detective showed up and took control of everything. She was calm and moved with this careful way like she had all the time in the world. Even though the house was full of chaos, someone told me her name was Detective Marisol Cade, and she asked me to show her the video evidence on my phone. Crime scene techs were photographing everything and putting little yellow markers next to the gun and the cereal box. I pulled out my phone and my hands were still shaking so bad I almost dropped it twice trying to unlock it. I found the video file and played it for Cade, holding the phone between us. She watched Curtis pour the cereal, reach into the cabinet, pull out the hidden prescription bottle, crush the pills, sprinkle them over the cereal, and mix it all in with milk. Her jaw got tight as she watched, and when it finished, she asked me to play it again. The second time through, she leaned in closer and I could see her eyes tracking every movement Curtis made. When it ended, she had a tech come over immediately and download the video file. They bagged my phone as evidence and gave me a receipt for it. Cade walked me into the living room while they took Curtis out to a squad car. I could see him through the front window, still crying and talking to the officers even though they weren't responding. Cade sat down across from me and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I started with the hospital appointment where the new doctor told me my son never had cancer. The words came out in a rush, and I kept jumping around in the timeline, but Cade just nodded and took notes and asked questions that helped me organize my thoughts. I told her about finding Bryn's comments on my husband's social media, meeting her at McDonald's, learning about Nora, the doctor, calling with the toxicology results, setting up the hidden camera. Cade wrote it all down and recorded the whole thing on a small device she set on the coffee table between us. When I got to the part about this morning and watching the video feed of Curtis poisoning the cereal, her pen stopped moving and she just looked at me for a long moment. I finished by describing how I ran back into the house and knocked the bowl away just before my son could eat it, and then Bryn burst in with the gun. Cade asked specific questions about Curtis's nursing background and whether he had access to medications at work. I told her everything I knew, which wasn't much because he didn't talk about work very often. Through the window, I watched them put Bryn in a different police car and she wasn't fighting or resisting at all. Cade saw me looking and told me Bryn was arrested, but it was protective custody for now since she brought a gun and made threats. She said Bryn would probably face charges for the weapon, but they understood why she did it. I watched Bryn sit in the back of the car with her head down and her shoulders slumped. Cade said Bryn wasn't resisting and actually looked relieved as they led her away, like she had been carrying something heavy for way too long and finally got to put it down. An officer finally tells me I can go next door to check on my son, and I practically run out the front door and across the lawn. Mr. Okafor answers before I can even knock, and my son appears behind him and rushes into my arms sobbing. I drop to my knees and hold him tight while he cries into my shoulder, and his whole body shakes against me. Mr. Okafor is an older man who lives alone, and he looks pretty shaken up himself with his hands trembling as he asks if we're all okay. I tell him yes and thank him for taking care of my son, and he just nods and says he's glad had to help. My son won't let go of me and keeps asking what happened and where daddy went. And I tell him everything is going to be okay now. The paramedic who checked him earlier comes over and asks if he can look at him again, and I nod while still holding his hand. He checks his pulse and looks at his eyes and listens to his breathing with his stethoscope. He tells me his vital signs are stable, but he really thinks we should go straight to the hospital for observation given what he's been through. I agree immediately without even thinking about it, and scoop my son up even though he's getting too big to carry anymore. He buries his face in my neck and wraps his arms around me, and I can feel his tears soaking through my shirt collar. Mr. Okafor walks us to my car and helps me get my son buckled into the back seat and tells me to call him if we need anything at all. I drive to the hospital emergency room with my son asking questions the whole way about why we have to go back and if he's going to get more shots. I try to keep my voice calm and tell him the doctors just want to make sure he's feeling better and that they're going to help him. When we get to the emergency room, Dr. Hollis is already waiting for us at the entrance, like she knew we were coming. She leads us straight back to a private room and immediately starts getting an IV ready, while a nurse brings in bags of clear fluids. She explains they need to flush the toxins out of his system and start medications to fight the methotrexate and arsenic damage as quickly as possible. My son starts crying when he sees the needles and IV equipment and tries to hide behind me. He's terrified of all the needles and monitors after months of thinking he had cancer and going through so many tests. He keeps asking where daddy is and why this is happening, and I don't know what to tell him yet. I can't just say that his father was poisoning him because he's only 7 years old. And how do you explain something like that to a child? So I just hold his hand tight and promise he's going to feel better soon and that the doctors are going to take good care of him. Dr. Hollis is patient and gentle as she gets the IV started, and my son squeezes my hand so hard it hurts, but I don't pull away. The nurse hooks up the monitors and my son flinches every time one of them beeps or makes a sound. A man in professional clothes comes into the room and introduces himself as Adrian Holt from the hospital social work department. He asks if he can speak with me privately for a moment, and I look at my son who is finally starting to calm down a little. Adrian pulls me aside just outside the room where I can still see my son through the window. He explains that CPS has been notified about the situation and will be involved going forward. His voice is gentle but firm when he tells me this is standard procedure when a child has been deliberately harmed by a parent. I feel my stomach drop because I know this means more interviews and investigations and people questioning everything. Adrian must see the look on my face because he quickly adds that this is to protect my son and make sure he's safe. He says a caseworker will come by tomorrow to talk to both of us and assess the situation. I nod and tell him I understand even though my head is spinning with everything that's happening. Back in the room, a nurse hands me a clipboard with consent forms for emergency treatment, and I try to focus on reading them. The words blur together as I try to process everything that just happened in the last 2 hours. My hands are shaking so badly that when I try to sign my name, it looks like a child's scribble, all crooked and messy. Adrian notices and comes over to study the clipboard for me so I can finish signing. He takes the forms and tells me he'll be checking in regularly and to let him know if we need anything. My son is lying in the hospital bed now with the IV in his arm, and he looks so small and scared. I pull a chair right up next to his bed and hold his other hand and tell him I'm not going anywhere. That evening, Detective Cade comes back to the hospital to take a formal statement from me. She's carrying evidence bags, and I can see the cereal box and the prescription bottle inside them through the clear plastic. She found them in our kitchen cabinet, exactly where Curtis kept them hidden behind the sugar. Cade sets up a small recording device on the table and asks me to start from the beginning and tell her everything. I walk her through the entire timeline, starting with the new oncologist's appointment, where he told me my son never had cancer. The words come out in a rush, and I keep jumping around in the story, but Cade just nods and takes notes. She asks me to slow down and go through it step by step, so I back up and start over. I tell her about the toxicology results and meeting Bryn at McDonald's and learning about Nora. I describe setting up the hidden camera and watching the video feed this morning of Curtis crushing pills into the cereal. Cade records everything and asks detailed questions about Curtis's nursing background and whether he had access to medications at work. I tell her he worked in pediatric oncology for 5 years before we met and that he knew exactly what drugs would cause cancer symptoms. She writes that down and asks more questions about how long the symptoms had been going on and what doctors we saw. When I finished, Cade tells me Curtis is being held without bail on attempted murder charges. The words hit me hard, even though I knew this was coming. She says Bryn is in custody on weapons charges, but she's cooperating fully with the investigation. Cade explains that the DA will want to meet with me tomorrow to discuss the case and what comes next. She says they have strong evidence with the video and the physical evidence and Bryn's testimony about Nora. I ask her what happens now, and she tells me to focus on my son's recovery and that they'll handle the legal side. Before she leaves, she gives me her card again and tells me to call her directly if I remember anything else or if anything seems off. That night, I try to sleep in the chair next to my son's hospital bed, but I keep jerking awake every time a monitor beeps. My son is restless and feverish from the treatment and keeps moving around under the blankets. I get up every few minutes to check on him and make sure he's still breathing. The nurses come in regularly to check his vital signs and adjust the IV, and each time they do, my son wakes up confused and scared. Around 3 in the morning, he finally falls into a deeper sleep, and I watch his chest rise and fall in the dim light from the monitors. I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing him and how I didn't see what Curtis was doing right in front of me for months. I keep replaying every breakfast and every dinner over the past year, every time Curtis insisted on making the meals himself, every time he told me to go rest while he took care of our son. I had thought he was being a good father. The memories make my skin crawl now. The morning sun wakes me up through the hospital room blinds, and I realize I slept maybe 2 hours total. A man in a gray suit knocks on the doorframe and introduces himself as Desmond Pruitt from Child Protective Services. He pulls a chair next to mine and sets a folder on his lap while explaining he needs to interview me about what happened and make sure my son will be safe going forward. I nod, and he starts asking questions about our home life and Curtis's behavior and how long the symptoms had been going on. I answer everything as honestly as I can and pull up the video on my phone showing Curtis crushing pills into the cereal. Desmond watches it twice and takes notes in his folder. He tells me he'll need to interview my son separately when he's feeling better, and my stomach twists into knots at the thought of strangers questioning him about this. Desmond must see my face because he assures me a child psychologist will be present and they'll be gentle. He closes his folder and says he'll be back tomorrow to check on us before leaving the room. Around noon, a hospital worker brings me to a small conference room where Assistant District Attorney Julian Navarro is waiting with files spread across the table. He's younger than I expected with sharp eyes, and he gets right to business laying out all the evidence they have so far. He explains that Curtis's nursing background actually strengthens their case because it proves he knew exactly what he was doing and planned it carefully. Julian asks if I knew about Bryn and her daughter Nora before all this happened. I explain how I found Bryn through the angry comments she kept leaving on my husband's fundraising page and how we met at McDonald's, where she told me about Nora being poisoned too. Julian writes this down and says Bryn's case will help establish a pattern that makes Curtis's actions even worse in the eyes of the law. He tells me the trial won't happen for several months, but they have enough evidence to keep Curtis locked up without bail. After the meeting, I go back to my son's room where Dr. Hollis is checking his monitors. She tells me the treatment is working and his toxin levels are dropping, but he'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, maybe longer. His liver and kidney functions took a beating from months of poison, and they need to watch him closely to make sure there's no permanent damage. I thank her and she pats my shoulder before leaving. I step into the hallway to call my boss and explain I won't be coming back to work for a while. He's understanding and tells me to take all the time I need, but I can hear the concern in his voice about how long I'll be gone. Money was already tight before all this, and now I have no idea how we'll pay the medical bills that keep piling up. I hang up and go back into the room where my son is starting to wake up. He looks around confused and asks where Daddy is. My chest feels heavy as I sit on the edge of his bed and try to figure out how to tell a child that his father was slowly killing him. I explain as gently as I can that Daddy was making him sick and that's why he has to stay in the hospital to get better. He stares at me with wide eyes full of confusion and something that looks like betrayal. He shakes his head and says, Daddy takes care of him and loves him and would never hurt him. I don't push it or argue because I know this is too much for him to understand right now. I just hold him while he cries and rocks back and forth asking for his daddy over and over. A nurse comes in to check on us, but backs out quietly when she sees my son sobbing. It takes almost an hour before he finally exhausts himself and falls back asleep with tears still wet on his cheeks. My phone rings later that afternoon, and it's Detective Cade calling with an update. She tells me they executed a search warrant on our house this morning and found more evidence that makes her sick to her stomach. Curtis kept a journal hidden in the bedroom closet where he documented every symptom my son showed and how he adjusted the poison doses based on the results. They also found a second stash of medications hidden inside a fishing tackle box in the garage. Cade's voice sounds disgusted as she describes reading Curtis's notes about calculating the perfect amount to keep my son sick but not kill him outright. She says they've sent everything to the forensic toxicologist for analysis, and she'll call me when they have more information. I thank her and hang up feeling nauseous at the thought of Curtis writing down his plans like some kind of sick experiment. The next day, Cade calls again to tell me the toxicologist, Dr. Ingrid Vosberg, finished examining all the evidence. Ingrid confirmed that the dosing pattern matches classic Munchausen by proxy, where a caregiver makes someone sick to get attention and sympathy. She found that Curtis knew exactly what he was doing and carefully calibrated the poisoning to mimic cancer symptoms without killing my son too quickly. Ingrid will testify at trial about how Curtis used his medical knowledge to cause maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability for months. Cade says this evidence combined with the video and Bryn's testimony about Nora makes their case extremely strong. I sit in the hospital chair after the call ends and watch my son sleep peacefully for the first time in months, and I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing him forever. 2 days later, my phone rings while I'm helping my son eat lunch in his hospital room. It's Cade calling to tell me that someone from Bryn's attorney's office wants to pass along a message. Bryn wants to apologize for bringing the gun and putting my son in danger during the confrontation. I grip the phone harder and tell Cade I'm not ready to talk to Bryn yet because I'm still angry about how close she came to making everything worse. What if the gun had gone off differently? What if my son had been hit? What if everything had ended right there in our kitchen? Cade says she understands and will let the attorney know, then asks how my son is doing. I tell her he's eating better today and the doctors are pleased with his progress. After we hang up, I look at my son picking at at his mashed potatoes and realize I need to focus on his recovery instead of my anger at Bryn. The next afternoon, Desmond returns with a man he introduces as Theo Brandt, a child psychologist who works with CPS on cases involving trauma. Theo has kind eyes and a gentle voice as he explains he needs to interview my son privately to assess his mental state and understanding of what happened. I don't want to leave my son alone, but Desmond assures me this is standard procedure and necessary for the case. A nurse leads me to a waiting area down the hall where I pace back and forth, checking my watch every few minutes. The interview takes over an hour, and I wear a path in the linoleum floor, walking from one end of the hallway to the other. Other families pass by, giving me sympathetic looks, but I barely notice them because all I can think about is what my son is telling Theo, and whether he's scared or confused or blaming himself somehow. Finally, the door opens and Theo emerges looking serious and tired. He asks if we can speak privately and leads me to a small consultation room with a table and 2 chairs. Theo sits across from me and folds his hands on the table before explaining that my son is showing signs of trauma bonding with Curtis. He says, children who are abused by their primary caregiver often struggle to understand that the person who hurt them is the same person they love and depend on. My son will need extensive therapy to process what happened and rebuild his sense of safety in the world. Theo recommends weekly sessions for at least 6 months and possibly longer, depending on how my son responds to treatment. I ask if my son will be okay eventually, and Theo says most children can recover with proper support, but the journey will take time and patience. Later that week, Adrian finds me in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee I haven't touched. He sits down across from me and pulls out a folder full of paperwork, explaining that he wants to help me apply for emergency financial assistance and crime victim compensation. The medical bills are already piling up, and I have no idea how I'm going to pay for everything on top of regular expenses. Adrian walks me through each form patiently, showing me where to sign and what documentation I need to provide. He assures me there are resources available for families in situations like ours, and that I shouldn't hesitate to ask for help. I'm overwhelmed by all the forms and legal language, but I fill them out as best I can while Adrian explains what each section means. He says the hospital has a financial assistance program that can help cover some of the costs, and the Victim Compensation Fund should provide additional support once the criminal case is resolved. That evening, my phone rings with a number I don't recognize from out of state. I answer and hear Curtis's mother on the other end, her voice shaking as she tells me she just found out about the arrest. She says there must be some mistake because her son would never hurt anyone, especially not his own child. I feel my jaw clench as I tell her about the video evidence showing Curtis poisoning the cereal and the toxicology reports confirming months of systematic poisoning. Curtis's mother starts making excuses, saying maybe Curtis was confused or didn't understand what he was doing. Maybe the medications got mixed up somehow. I can't listen to any more of her denial, and I tell her the facts are clear before hanging up. My hands are shaking with anger because I can't handle hearing someone defend Curtis when my son almost died because of his actions. 3 weeks later, Julian calls with news from the grand jury proceedings. He sounds pleased as he tells me they indicted Curtis on multiple counts, including attempted murder, child abuse, and fraud related to the fundraising page. The trial is set for 4 months out, which gives us time to prepare all the evidence and witness testimony. Julian explains that the delay also allows my son more time to heal before we have to put him through the stress of trial proceedings. Part of me wants this over with immediately, but another part is relieved we have time to build the strongest possible case. Julian assures me the evidence is solid and he's confident about getting a conviction, but the waiting feels unbearable when I just want Curtis held accountable for what he did. Over the next week, my son's condition slowly improves in ways that seem almost miraculous after months of decline. His color returns to his cheeks, and his appetite comes back stronger each day. He asks for seconds at meals and actually finishes his plates instead of pushing food around. Dr. Hollis examines him during morning rounds and tells me she's cautiously optimistic about his progress. She warns that he'll need regular monitoring for possible long-term effects on his liver and kidneys from the prolonged poisoning. The damage might not show up for years, and we'll need to stay vigilant about his health going forward. But seeing him sit up in bed coloring and actually smiling makes me feel hopeful for the first time since this nightmare began. A few days later, Cade stops by the hospital with an envelope she says is from Bryn. I take it reluctantly and wait until Cade leaves before opening it. Inside is a handwritten letter where Bryn apologizes for her actions and explains her grief over Nora. She writes that she should have gone to police with her suspicions years ago instead of just posting warnings online that no one believed. She says she got desperate and angry watching Curtis get away with killing her daughter, and she couldn't let it happen again. The letter is raw and painful to read because I can feel her anguish in every word. Bryn admits bringing the gun was wrong, and she's grateful no one got hurt because of her actions. She says she hopes my son recovers fully, and that I can forgive her someday for putting him in danger. I sit with the letter for 2 days before finally writing back. I tell Bryn I'm not ready to forgive her for bringing the gun into my house and threatening violence in front of my son, but I acknowledge that she tried to warn people when no one else would listen, and her warnings ultimately helped me see the truth before it was too late. I write about my son's progress and how he's gaining weight and strength back each day. I thank her for helping me understand what Curtis was doing, even though her methods were dangerous and wrong. I don't know if we'll ever be friends, but I recognize recognized that she suffered a terrible loss and tried to prevent the same thing from happening to my family. I give the letter to Cade to deliver and hope it brings Bryn some small measure of peace. The following week, Desmond completes his assessment and schedules a meeting to discuss his recommendations. He sits across from me in a conference room at the hospital and reviews his findings. Desmond says he's recommending that I retain full custody with supervised visitation requirements if Curtis is ever released from prison. He explains that I've demonstrated my ability to protect my son and respond appropriately to the crisis. Desmond is confident in my parenting, but wants regular check-ins over the next year to monitor our situation and make sure my son continues to receive proper care and therapy. He'll file his report with the court, and it will become part of the custody proceedings that will happen alongside the criminal trial. I feel relief wash over me knowing that Desmond supports keeping my son with me, because losing custody on top of everything else would destroy what's left of our family. The hospital started discharge planning 3 days later after my son's test results showed enough improvement. Adrian met with me in a small conference room and spread out a stack of paperwork across the table. He explained that my son would need home health visits twice a week for the first month to monitor his recovery. I signed form after form while Adrian made phone calls to set up appointments with specialists. He scheduled follow-ups with a kidney doctor, a liver specialist, and a nutritionist who would help rebuild my son's strength. The appointments filled up the next 2 months on a calendar Adrian printed out for me. He highlighted each one in different colors and explained what tests would happen at each visit. I felt overwhelmed looking at all those colored boxes, but nodded and took notes on everything he said. Adrian also gave me emergency numbers and told me to call immediately if my son showed any signs of getting worse. Before we could leave the hospital, Theo stopped by the room with a folder full of papers. He sat down on the edge of my son's bed and talked to me about what came next. Theo explained that my son would need ongoing therapy to process what happened and that trauma shows up in different ways for kids. He gave me a list of warning signs to watch for, like nightmares, changes in eating, being scared of certain places or people, and acting younger than his age. Theo recommended weekly therapy sessions and said, my son should see someone who works specifically with kids who went through medical trauma. He also suggested I get counseling for myself because watching your child almost die leaves marks too. I promised I would look into it, but honestly, I was just focused on getting my son home and keeping him safe. Adrian came back with discharge instructions and helped us pack up the few things we had in the room. My son was quiet as we walked out to the car, holding tight to my hand. The drive home felt strange after spending so much time at the hospital. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the front door looked normal, but my hands shook putting the key in the lock. Inside, everything was clean. Too clean. The crime scene people had removed all the broken glass and wiped down the kitchen. But when I looked up, I could see the bullet hole in the ceiling right above where Bryn had been standing. My son saw it too and stopped walking. I tried to block his view, but he had already seen it and his face went pale. I told him we didn't have to stay here long and started thinking about how fast I could find us a new place. This house had too many bad memories now. Every room reminded me of what Curtis did and how close we came to losing everything. I decided right then that we needed to move as soon as possible. My son followed me from room to room as I checked to make sure everything was okay. He wouldn't let me out of his sight, not even for a second. When I went to the bathroom, he stood outside the door. When I went to get something from my bedroom, he came with me. At dinner time, I made simple pasta, but he stared at his plate without eating. He asked if the food was safe, and I realized he was scared I might poison him too. I had to show him every ingredient, let him watch me open each package, and let him see me cook everything. Even then, he only ate a few bites. The next morning, Cade called while I was making breakfast. She told me that Curtis's old employer at the pediatric ward finally got back to her with information. They confirmed Curtis was asked to resign 3 years ago after concerns came up about his behavior with patients. Cade said the hospital wouldn't give her details at first, but eventually admitted there were complaints from other nurses about Curtis spending too much time with certain sick kids. Nothing was formally documented or reported to any authorities. They just let him quietly leave. I felt anger burn through me as Cade talked. The hospital let him walk away instead of investigating what he was doing. If they had looked into it, they might have figured out what happened to Nora. They might have stopped him before he got to my son. Cade said they were looking into whether the hospital could be held responsible, but her main focus was building the criminal case against Curtis. She told me not to contact the hospital directly because it could mess up the investigation. A week later, Julian called and asked me to come to his office to prepare for trial. I left my son with Mr. Castellano next door and drove downtown. Julian's office was small and packed with file boxes. He cleared off a chair for me and explained that I would need to testify about everything I witnessed and discovered. We spent 3 hours going over my testimony. Julian asked me questions and I practiced answering them. He coached me on how to stay calm and stick to the facts when I was on the witness stand. He warned me that Curtis's lawyer would try to make me seem unreliable or confused. We practiced over and over until I could tell the story without getting too emotional. He told me the defense would pick at the smallest inconsistency to make the jury doubt everything, so I needed every detail straight in my head. Julian said the video evidence was strong, but my testimony would help the jury understand the full picture of what Curtis did. That same week, Cade stopped by to tell me Bryn had accepted a plea deal. Bryn got probation and mandatory counseling in exchange for testifying against Curtis. Cade said Bryn was sorry about bringing the gun and had been helping them build the case. Bryn gave them details about Nora's case that showed a clear pattern in how Curtis operated. The information Bryn provided made the evidence against Curtis even stronger. I still felt conflicted about Bryn, but I understood she was trying to make things right. 2 weeks after coming home from the hospital, my son had his first therapy appointment with Theo. I drove him to the office and sat in the waiting room feeling nervous. The session lasted almost an hour, and I kept checking my watch. When the door finally opened, my son came out looking tired, but okay. Theo walked him to me and gave me a small nod that seemed encouraging. He scheduled another appointment for the following week. On the drive home, my son was quiet, but he held my hand. Meanwhile, medical bills started arriving in the mail. Thick envelopes came every few days with charges for emergency treatment, hospital stays, tests, and medications. I used up all my sick leave and vacation time from work. The fundraising money Curtis collected was frozen as evidence, so I couldn't access it to pay anything. I had to apply for public assistance just to keep us going. I filled out forms for food stamps and medical payment plans. The financial stress added to everything else we were dealing with. I lay awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how we would make it through the next few months. Some nights, I added up the same numbers 3 or 4 times because they never came out any better, and I would stare at the ceiling until the sky started turning gray. Weeks later, Julian called to tell me the trial date was set for 2 months out and I needed to be ready. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. I took my son to therapy twice a week and watched him slowly start to trust again. He asked questions about the trial, and I tried to explain it in ways he could understand without scaring him more. The day the trial started, I dropped him off at Mr. Castellano's house and drove to the courthouse with my hands shaking on the wheel. The courtroom was smaller than I expected and filled with people I didn't know. I sat behind Julian at the prosecutor's table and tried to breathe normally. The jury selection took 2 days, and then the trial actually began. Julian presented the video evidence first, and the courtroom went silent as everyone watched Curtis crush those pills and mix them into the cereal. Several jurors looked sick. Then came the medical testimony about the poisoning and what it did to my son's body. Dr. Hollis explained the organ damage and the months of unnecessary suffering. I had to leave the courtroom twice because I couldn't handle hearing the details again. On the 3rd day, Bryn took the stand. She wore a suit that looked too big on her and her hands trembled as she was sworn in. Julian asked her about Nora, and Bryn's voice cracked as she described her daughter's final days. She talked about the hair loss and weakness and how Nora had begged her to make the pain stop. The jury looked horrified. Bryn explained how she discovered the poisoning too late and how she tried to warn people about Curtis, but nobody believed her. Then Ingrid took the stand and walked the jury through the toxicology evidence. She used charts and diagrams to show how Curtis used his medical knowledge to cause maximum suffering while keeping everything looking like cancer symptoms. She explained that the dosing pattern showed careful planning and that Curtis knew exactly what he was doing. The jury members were taking notes and several looked angry. On the 4th day, Curtis took the stand against Whitlock's advice. I could see her trying to stop him, but he insisted. He wore a simple suit and kept his voice soft as he testified. He claimed he only wanted to help his son, and things got out of control. He said he didn't mean for it to go so far, but his testimony came across cold and calculated. He showed no real emotion and kept making excuses. I watched the jury and could see they weren't buying it. One woman in the front row was shaking her head. When Julian cross-examined Curtis, he tore apart every excuse. Curtis got defensive and his mask slipped. By the end, everyone could see through his act. The jury got the case after closing arguments, and I went home to wait. 6 hours later, Julian called and told me to get back to the courthouse. The jury had reached a verdict. I drove back with my stomach in knots. We all stood as the jury filed back in. The foreman handed the verdict forms to the judge. He read each count out loud. Guilty on attempted murder, guilty on child abuse, guilty on fraud, guilty on all counts. Curtis showed no emotion at all as the verdicts were read. He just sat there staring straight ahead like none of it mattered, but I felt something lift from my chest. He would be held accountable. Whitlock asked for bail pending sentencing, but the judge denied it. Curtis was led away in handcuffs, and I finally let myself breathe. 3 weeks later, we were back for sentencing. Julian had me prepare a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium and read from my notes about how the poisoning affected my son's physical and mental health. I described the hospital stays and the fear and the nightmares he still has. I talked about how he flinches when I hand him food and asks if it's safe to eat. My voice shook, but I got through it. The judge listened carefully and took notes. Then he announced the sentence. 25 years in prison with mandatory mental health treatment, permanent loss of nursing license, no contact with my son, ever. Curtis still showed no reaction. He was led away and I knew it was finally over. After the sentencing, I picked up my son from Mr. Castellano's and we drove to the park. We sat on the swings together and he asked if we were safe now. I promised him we were. I told him Daddy couldn't hurt him anymore and I would always protect him. He held my hand and we swung together in silence. 6 months after the poisoning stopped, my son's hair started growing back thick and dark. He gained weight and his color returned. The doctor said his organs were healing well. He still had nightmares sometimes and needed routines that made him feel secure. But Theo said he was making remarkable progress. He was learning to be a kid again. I got promoted at work with a raise that helped us get back on our feet. My boss had been incredibly supportive through everything. The crime victim compensation covered most of the medical bills. We were building a new normal that felt genuinely hopeful. My son and I created new traditions in our apartment. Friday Friday movie nights where he picked the film, Sunday morning pancakes where he helped me cook, bedtime stories where he was always the hero who saved the day. He was learning to trust again.